When I first moved into the neighborhood, I was immediately drawn to its charm and sense of community. The streets were lined with well-maintained homes adorned with vibrant gardens, and the air seemed to hum with the laughter of children playing outside. Neighbors exchanged friendly waves and smiles, creating an atmosphere that felt welcoming and warm. The Homeowners Association, HOA, was a palpable presence in this idyllic setting, tasked with maintaining property values and ensuring that the community adhered to certain standards. At my first community meeting, I learned about the HOA's role in managing shared spaces, parks, pathways, and common areas designed to enhance our quality of life. They discussed ambitious plans for neighborhood beautification projects and rules aimed at preserving a picturesque environment. However, amid their carefully crafted agenda lay a fundamental truth. The HOA wielded significant power over our daily lives. Decisions ranging from landscaping choices to architectural modifications required approval, and deviations from established guidelines could bring unpleasant consequences. In those early days, I thought nothing of the enforcement measures in place. They seemed reasonable enough to maintain order. My husband and I quickly embraced our new home, even adopting a playful puppy named Max, a lively ball of fur who brought energy and joy into our lives. We reveled in long walks around the neighborhood, Max prancing happily alongside us while other residents commented on his infectious spirit. Little did I know that this joy would soon become overshadowed by the shadow of the very organization meant to protect our community. It wasn't long before we received our first letter from the HOA. To my disbelief, it contained a stern warning regarding Max's breed, an unauthorized classification according to their regulations. The letter threatened fines that escalated with each subsequent infraction, as though our decision to welcome Max into our family had become a transgression worthy of punishment. I knew with certainty that we had all necessary documentation proving that his breed was not illegal in our jurisdiction, yet it didn't seem to matter. The HOA was adamant about enforcing their rules as they saw fit. This initial clash left me feeling unsettled, but also surprisingly resolute. How could an organization built on community cooperation turn so quickly into an antagonistic entity? Neighbors began murmuring about similar encounters. My mounting frustration was echoed by others facing punitive measures under dubious claims. Each letter from the HOA felt increasingly isolating, as if it were forcing us into a corner rather than fostering a spirit of camaraderie. In those moments of anxiety, however, there was something comforting I could rely upon. My husband's unwavering support as the town's police chief grounded me amidst this chaos. He understood deeply how power could be misused and recognized the need for accountability in any organization wielding authority over residents' lives. Faced with mounting harassment from the HOA, I realized that this situation could not continue unchallenged, not for Max or for ourselves as members of this community. As quarry-like walls began closing in around me, all fueled by an unintended aggressor focused on enforcing their interpretation of compliance, I prepared to take action against these injustices. With connections and firm resolve bolstered by my husband's role within local law enforcement, it became clear. Challenging this status quo might just redefine what it meant to stand up for one's rights within our own neighborhood and put an end to this insidious harassment for good. After settling into our new home, Max quickly became a beloved member of our family, a spirited Australian shepherd with a striking combination of intelligence and playfulness. His lively antics filled our days with laughter, whether he was chasing after a stick or playfully barking at his own reflection. However, it soon became clear that the HOA had different opinions about what constituted an acceptable pet in the neighborhood. One sunny afternoon, while I played fetch with Max in our backyard, I noticed a neighbor walking by with her small poodle. She paused, smiled at Max, and commented on how beautiful he was. But the joy of that moment was soon eclipsed by the arrival of our first official notice from the HOA. The letter arrived like an unwelcome guest, stamped with authority and dripping with disdain. It classified Max as part of an unauthorized dog breed list, an assertion that completely baffled me. I took a closer look at the letter and found that it cited specific rules from the community bylaws outlining prohibited breeds, but they seemed vague and open to interpretation. Australian Shepherds were not listed among those banned breeds in any law I could find nor explicitly mentioned in the HOA guidelines. This discrepancy left me feeling both frustrated and determined to defend my furry companion. Even more perplexing was the fact that we had gone through the necessary channels to ensure we were in compliance before adopting Max. We had even consulted local laws regarding breed restrictions. We obtained documentation confirming his status, proof from reputable sources detailing that Australian shepherds were not only allowed in our area, but celebrated for their friendly demeanor and intelligence. It felt surreal to think that all this official validation could be so easily disregarded by an organization asserting its control over residents' lives. In my quest to understand how this situation had escalated so rapidly, I began to dig into the HOA's history and its policies surrounding pet ownership. A closer look revealed a pattern of selective enforcement that raised red flags. For instance, several neighbors owned larger dogs or breeds considered less desirable by some standards yet faced no scrutiny or reprimand from the HOA. It seemed these rules were often enforced based on personal bias rather than clear legal foundations. Weeks passed, each day bringing another letter from the HOA threatening fines if I didn't comply with their absurd demands regarding Max's breed designation. With every threat came feelings of isolation. It seemed as though they were determined to make me feel unwelcome in my own home because I dared to stand out for having what they deemed an unapproved dog. Friends who used to greet us warmly now looked away uneasily when we walked past, caught between loyalty and fear of potential repercussions from the association. Fueled by mounting frustration and confusion, I reached out to others in the community who shared similar experiences with enforcement discrepancies related to pets. Their stories mirrored mine. Arbitrary rules appeared to target certain residents while allowing others to slip through unnoticed, an alarming trend that indicated much more than just administrative oversight. Ever notice how standing up for what's right has a way of bringing unexpected allies? Kind of like how subscribing to this channel just might bring you good karma. Let's keep unraveling this mess. Back to the story. Amidst all this turmoil, a sense of resolve began building within me. A fierce determination not just for my rights, but also for every neighbor impacted by this capricious power wielded by the HOA. With documentation proving Max's legality firmly in hand and an understanding of my community's silent struggles behind me, I prepared myself to take action against this injustice. This moment would not only define my fight for Max, but also signify a stand against tyranny hiding behind the guise of neighborhood governance. As the days turned into weeks, the relentless barrage of letters from the HOA escalated, each one more threatening than the last. What began as a single notification quickly morphed into a campaign of intimidation, aimed squarely at me and my beloved Max. Each letter seemed designed to instill fear, demanding compliance in increasingly severe tones, as if the association relished the power it wielded over unsuspecting homeowners. The first few letters were relatively mild, but they set a grim tone. The HOA claimed that I had violated community rules by harboring an unauthorized breed and demanded I remove Max from the property within a specified time frame or face escalating fines. The penalties outlined in those letters were staggering, starting at $100 for the first infraction and doubling for each subsequent offense. By the time I reached the fourth letter, the threat of losing hundreds of dollars loomed like a dark cloud over my head. With each new letter, I felt an unsettling mix of anger and disbelief. The HOA's language was formal yet laced with an unmistakable sense of superiority. They insisted I provide proof that Max was indeed a permitted breed or risk, facing not just financial penalties, but also potential legal action. It was as though I were being accused of harboring a criminal instead of caring for a cherished family pet. Their tone implied that my character and commitment to community standards were now under scrutiny. The next letter arrived a week later, this time warning me that failure to comply could result in further actions, including possible eviction from my home. The HOA's audacity was shocking. How could they threaten my family with such drastic measures over a dog? I felt cornered and isolated, grappling with the reality that my neighbors might be watching and judging me based on information delivered through these letters. Their words pierced through my defenses, sowing seeds of doubt about how well I truly belonged in this community. Around this time, I began to notice subtle changes in how some neighbors interacted with us. Conversations that once flowed easily became strained and cautious, as though they were choosing their words carefully to avoid drawing the HOA's ire. I overheard whispers about our situation, some sympathetic, others tinged with judgment. It was as if the HOA had transformed us from respected members of the neighborhood into pariahs overnight. Despite feeling overwhelmed, I refused to back down. With each letter that arrived, my resolve strengthened. I meticulously documented every correspondence from the HOA, highlighting inconsistencies and ambiguous regulations that seemed to target us disproportionately. As I gathered evidence of their harassment, I began reaching out to other residents who had experienced similar issues with the HOA. It was eye-opening to hear their stories. Many shared accounts of arbitrary enforcement and discrimination against certain breeds, while others faced no consequences at all. Armed with this newfound knowledge and bolstered by a sense of solidarity among fellow homeowners, I felt ready to confront this injustice head-on. Each letter had become a catalyst for change rather than a source of fear. It galvanized us into action. My husband's position as police chief provided an added layer of strength to our cause. He understood the importance of accountability and transparency in governance. As we prepared to take formal action against the HOA, I felt a surge of empowerment wash over me. This wasn't just about protecting Max anymore. It was about standing up for every resident who had ever felt powerless against an overreaching authority. We would challenge their tactics and fight back with everything we had, transforming our struggle into a collective movement for fairness and respect within our community. The HOA may have underestimated us, but they were about to learn that targeting the wrong person could have consequences far beyond mere financial penalties. The relentless barrage of letters from the HOA weighed heavily on me, but as the situation intensified, so did my resolve. Each threatening missive ignited a fire within me, a fierce determination to stand up not just for Max, but for myself and every resident who had ever felt the suffocating grip of the HOA's authority. I was no longer willing to back down or allow myself to be intimidated by an organization that seemed to thrive on instilling fear in its members. As I reflected on my feelings, I recognized a profound sense of injustice fueling my defiance. This wasn't merely about my beloved dog, it was about the principle of fairness and respect in our community. The HOA's selective enforcement tactics highlighted a systematic problem, a governing body that had strayed from its original purpose of fostering community spirit and cooperation. Instead, it had morphed into an oppressive regime, wielding power over its residents without regard for the consequences of their actions. I began to think about the implications of this harassment. What did it mean for me as a homeowner and for all those who shared our neighborhood? The fear instilled by the HOA threatened to fracture the very bonds of community that I had initially cherished. I could see how many neighbors, once friendly and warm, were now hesitant to engage with us, perhaps fearing they might draw the ire of the association themselves. That alone motivated me further. I refused to let Max and me become scapegoats in this game of intimidation. Determined to protect my rights, I immersed myself in researching local laws and regulations governing pet ownership and homeowners associations. It became clear that not only was I in the right regarding Max's legality, but I also had allies in this fight, neighbors who had suffered under similar circumstances. Realizing that my plight resonated with others ignited a spark of hope within me. We were not alone. Together we could challenge the tyranny of the HOA. Drawing strength from this growing sense of community, I confronted my fears head-on. The initial anxiety I felt when opening each letter began to transform into empowerment as I meticulously documented their demands and threats. A plan started to take shape in my mind. We would gather proof of their arbitrary enforcement and seek justice not just for ourselves, but for everyone impacted by their oppressive rules. My husband's position as police chief added another layer of support. He understood intimately how organizations could abuse their power and recognized the importance of standing up against such overreach. With his backing, I felt emboldened, no longer just a frightened homeowner under siege, but an advocate ready to reclaim our rights. It was time to take action. Alongside neighbors sharing similar grievances, we organized ourselves into a united front against the HOA's bullying tactics. There was power in numbers, and as we spoke out together, we discovered new depths of resilience within ourselves. Each meeting with fellow residents reinforced our collective resolve. We became allies armed with knowledge, intent on challenging an authority that had long silenced dissent. This journey transformed me from a passive recipient of threats into an active participant in shaping our community's future. The moment crystallized around an understanding that standing up against injustice was not merely a personal battle. It was a necessary stance for maintaining integrity within our beloved neighborhood. My love for Max blossomed into something more profound, the recognition that we all deserved respect and fairness in our home. Fueled by renewed passion and unwavering determination, I prepared to confront the HOA with solid evidence supporting our case. The time had come for them to understand that their intimidation tactics would no longer work against us, and that together, we would fight back against their overreach with everything we had. As I prepared to challenge the HOA's overreach, I couldn't help but reflect on how my husband's role as the town's police chief provided an unexpected advantage in our fight. His position offered not only a sense of security, but also the leverage to confront the HOA with confidence. While I was standing up for my rights as a homeowner and a pet owner, he was my steadfast supporter behind the scenes, equipped with knowledge of the law and a deep understanding of community governance. David had always been passionate about justice and fairness, traits that drew me to him long before we were married. He had earned the respect of many in the town through his commitment to serve and protect, and it was reassuring to know that his expertise could be instrumental in navigating this messy confrontation with the HOA. Conversations we'd had over dinner took on new meaning as we strategized together. His insights into local laws bolstered my determination and illuminated our path forward. When I first opened those letters from the HOA, I felt increasingly helpless. But discussing them with David transformed my anxiety into focus. He encouraged me to document every interaction with the association meticulously, emphasizing that concrete evidence would be essential should we escalate our efforts. "Don't let them intimidate you," he reminded me with unwavering conviction. "They may be powerful, but they can't manipulate the truth." With every consultation we had, David helped me understand how our situation fit into broader legal frameworks governing homeowners associations. His knowledge about selective enforcement, an issue he frequently encountered in his line of work, provided clarity for our case against the HOA. We began compiling data from neighbors' experiences, finding evidence of arbitrary rule application that pointed towards systemic bias rather than objective enforcement. This collaboration transformed our living room into a hub of activism where we strategized late into many evenings. Spreadsheets filled with notes, copies of the HOA's letters, and testimonies from fellow residents covered our dining table like a battleground map. David would often pause amidst our planning sessions to remind me about the importance of being fair-minded even when confronting what felt like an unjust foe. He believed firmly in addressing issues with integrity, no matter how strong our emotions became. With his backing, my confidence surged anew each day. I felt empowered not just by knowledge, but by having someone who understood deeply what it meant to uphold laws and advocate for community ethics alongside me. David's unique perspective as law enforcement helped me craft arguments that would resonate not just within our neighborhood, but also when taken to formal authorities. The moment arrived when we decided to file an official complaint against the HOA for harassment, a decision bolstered by my husband's unequivocal support. Standing together at our kitchen island adorned with stacks of paperwork, I felt an unwavering sense of camaraderie between us. This fight was no longer mine alone. Together, we were forging a united front against a force that threatened not just individual rights, but potentially the fabric of community solidarity itself. One evening, after a long day of organizing grievances from neighbors and preparing our documentation, David turned to me with pride shining in his eyes. "You're not just fighting for Max," he said solemnly. "We are fighting for everyone who has felt powerless." This partnership deepened my understanding that this struggle was about collective empowerment, a realization that transcended personal stakes. As we prepared to take action against the HOA armed with solid evidence and legal grounding, I knew we were ready for whatever might come next. With each step forward, supported by my husband's authority and belief in justice, we were set to confront not only an organization but an ideology cloaked in power, one that would soon learn their discriminatory practices wouldn't go unchallenged any longer. Together, we stood strong as advocates for fairness within our community, resolute in making things right for ourselves and those who felt equally affected by unjust authority. With a clear goal in mind, David and I began to strategize how to effectively gather evidence of the HOA's selective enforcement. The more we learned about the inconsistencies in how rules were applied, the more motivated we became to expose these injustices. Our initial focus was on meticulously documenting every interaction we had with the HOA, but it quickly became apparent that to challenge their authority effectively, we needed a broader understanding of how their practices affected other residents. To start, we reached out to our neighbors, sharing our experiences and asking if they had encountered similar issues. It didn't take long for several households to express their concerns about arbitrary rule enforcement. One neighbor, Karen, recounted her ordeal involving fines for keeping a bird feeder in her yard. an item the HOA deemed an eyesore, while another family was allowed to have a large and unsightly garden shed that clearly violated community guidelines. Their stories echoed mine, revealing a pattern of biased enforcement that targeted specific homeowners while others appeared immune. Encouraged by these discussions, we organized a small gathering at our house, inviting neighbors who were willing to share their experiences. It was an emotional evening filled with stories of frustration and resentment toward the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. As we talked over snacks and drinks, it became clear that many felt powerless and isolated due to the intimidating nature of the association. This collective vulnerability fostered a sense of camaraderie among us. Residents who had previously only exchanged pleasantries at the mailbox now bonded over shared grievances. Armed with anecdotes from our neighbors, we began creating a detailed spreadsheet that tracked instances of selective enforcement. We categorized various complaints, ranging from pet-related issues like mine to violations regarding landscaping and fencing regulations, and documented the discrepancies between how different rules were enforced across households. Each entry provided further evidence of the HOA's bias and reinforced our resolve to take action. In addition to personal testimonies, David encouraged me to look up any available public records regarding previous complaints filed against the HOA. This research unveiled a trove of information. Records showed that many residents had expressed concerns to local authorities about harassment or unfair treatment, but had generally received inadequate responses. The realization that others had also fought against this oppressive force deepened my commitment to seeing this through. As our knowledge base expanded, David's law enforcement background became invaluable in framing our case. He reviewed our findings closely, highlighting which aspects could be most compelling when presented formally. "You need to show them not just what they've done wrong," he advised me, "but also how their actions have impacted the community as a whole." His insight helped clarify our mission. It wasn't merely about defending Max or gaining personal vindication. It was about restoring fairness and equity within our neighborhood. With each passing day, I felt more empowered, not just because of my resolve, but because I was rallying my community around a common cause. Together with David's passion for justice and my neighbors' willingness to stand united against fear-based governance, I began envisioning what could happen if we presented this evidence effectively. Perhaps not just accountability from the HOA, but also a renewed sense of unity among residents who had felt divided by fear. Our next step was crucial: filing formal complaints and presenting this gathered evidence not only to HOA leadership, but also bringing it before local authorities who oversaw community governance. Armed with testimonials and documented proof of selective enforcement practices, we were ready to take action that would hopefully resonate beyond just our situation, a movement towards reclaiming fairness in a system that had seemingly forgotten its purpose. As we solidified our plan for confronting the HOA with our findings, I felt an exhilarating mix of trepidation and hope, a reminder that standing together could yield power against an unjust authority determined to maintain control through fear tactics. We were no longer just individuals facing an oppressive organization. We were now allies fighting for what we believed was right, all for Max and for every member within our precious community who deserved respect and fairness as their fundamental rights. As the day approached to file our formal complaint against the HOA, a mix of apprehension and excitement filled the air. This was more than just a formality. It was a pivotal moment that could determine the future of our neighborhood and protect the rights of its residents. With David guiding me through each step, I felt a newfound confidence that we were doing something meaningful. We began by carefully drafting our complaint, ensuring it was clear, concise, and well supported by evidence. David suggested using a formal template for legal complaints, which emphasized both the specific violations of the HOA rules and how those violations had impacted us personally. It was essential to articulate not merely the facts, but also the emotional toll these threats had taken on our lives. This wasn't just about Max or my rights as a homeowner. It was about restoring fairness in our community. After several drafts, we finalized our complaint. It included testimonies from neighbors who had faced similar harassment from the HOA, alongside documented instances of inconsistent rule enforcement. I vividly recalled Corinne's story about her bird feeder being singled out when others were allowed to keep much larger structures without penalty. Those details lent credence to our case and highlighted systemic issues within the HOA's practices. With our complaint drafted, we next needed to gather additional documentation. We organized all relevant correspondence with the HOA, including their threatening letters and any responses we might have received. Each piece of paper became part of our case, a meticulously constructed narrative outlining not only what had happened, but also how it contradicted community principles. Unsure about where to submit this complaint, we consulted David's colleagues at the police department. They provided insights into local governing bodies responsible for overseeing HOAs and explained how to present our case effectively to them. Armed with this knowledge, we prepared ourselves for possible questions or challenges during any review process. Finally, on the day we planned to submit our complaint, I felt a swirl of emotions. Nervousness battled with determination as we stood outside the local authorities' office. The gravity of what we were about to do struck me like an electric jolt. This was an act of defiance against an organization that had sought to intimidate us into silence. With one significant move, we were reclaiming not only my rights but also standing up for every neighbor who had felt oppressed. David took my hand as we walked inside together. His calming presence steadied my racing heart. We approached the front desk where an official greeted us, and in that moment everything seemed surreal yet empowering. I handed over the compilation of documents while explaining briefly who we were and why we were filing this complaint. After some discussion about procedural matters and what would happen next, we left that office feeling lighter yet resolute in purpose. The weight of uncertainty still hung in the air. How would the HOA react? Would they continue their harassment or change their ways? But it didn't matter at this point. What mattered was that we took action. In subsequent days, word spread throughout our neighborhood about what we had done. While some neighbors expressed concern over potential repercussions from the HOA, many others voiced their admiration for standing up against intimidation tactics. We felt an overwhelming sense of solidarity. Encouraging whispers turned into conversations about community meetings where residents could express their grievances collectively. Filing that formal complaint marked a crucial turning point, not just for us but for everyone in our neighborhood seeking justice against unfair governance practices. Empowered by our actions and buoyed by support from fellow residents, I recognized that this journey strengthened both my commitment toward protecting Max and reinvigorated community ties among those who longed for fairness. As days turned into weeks following our submission, I held on to hope. Hope that perhaps this challenge could lead to change, not only for us but also fostering respect among all homeowners facing similar struggles within this once charming neighborhood now marred by fear-based control tactics employed by its own leaders. Whatever awaited us next would be met head-on, with courage rooted in unity and a shared commitment to reclaiming what it meant to truly belong in a community built on trust and fairness instead of fear. After filing our formal complaint against the HOA, we eagerly awaited their reaction. Given the stakes involved, both for us and for many residents who felt similarly oppressed, it was crucial to understand how the HOA would respond to being challenged so publicly. The initial silence from the association was deafening, but it didn't take long for the ripple effects of our actions to manifest. Within a week, we noticed subtle shifts in the HOA's behavior. Their tone had changed markedly. No longer were there aggressive threats in their communications. Instead, subsequent letters seemed almost conciliatory, filled with reminders about the benefits of collaboration and community spirit. They even began to reference the importance of adhering to overall guidelines, suggesting that they were considering revisiting some rules to ensure fairness and transparency. This newfound willingness to engage felt like a step in the right direction, though I couldn't shake off the underlying suspicion that they were merely attempting to placate us while still maintaining their grip on power. David and I discussed this change. He suggested that their shift in strategy might be a response to our formal complaint coupled with knowledge of my husband's position as police chief. Perhaps they saw potential repercussions not just from our claims, but from increased scrutiny should any community discontent become more organized or publicized. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating among our neighbors. Word about the complaint had spread quickly through informal channels, leading many residents who had previously kept their heads down to voice their concerns more openly at community gatherings. People who once felt isolated were standing together in solidarity, sharing stories and grievances regarding HOA treatment that mirrored ours. This new camaraderie invigorated our neighborhood as residents began discussing collective methods for holding the HOA accountable. During one such gathering, an older couple named the Thompsons shared their experience with excessive fines over minor landscaping changes, a situation that echoed my own frustrations. It felt like they were just waiting for us to slip up, Mr. Thompson said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. The room buzzed with agreement. Empowerment blossomed among them as they realized they weren't alone anymore. The most striking response came when a few board members from the HOA attended one of these community meetings unannounced. It was clear they were attempting damage control. Their presence validated what many residents had begun advocating for, a more transparent and fair enforcement of rules moving forward. Yet I sensed an air of defensiveness among them as well. They were losing control over the narrative built on fear. The board members attempted to assure everyone that they would conduct a review of existing policies and invite input from homeowners on changes needed to promote equity within enforcement practices. While their intentions may have been genuine, there was a lingering doubt about whether true reform could occur under such entrenched leadership. This reaction only fueled my determination further. A subtle acknowledgement by the HOA that changes might be necessary suggested we had struck a nerve with our complaint. But I knew this battle wasn't over yet. Their apparent goodwill could easily dissolve if we allowed ourselves to grow complacent or overlooked how critical it remained to push for transparency. Over the next several weeks, David and I meticulously monitored any developments related to our complaint, while encouraging other neighbors also impacted by selective enforcement to remain vigilant and continue voicing their concerns. Meanwhile, I worked on gathering signatures for a petition aimed at formally requesting further discussions about policy reviews and amendments tied directly to community input, an initiative designed both as a show of strength and unity among residents. The ball was set rolling. It felt empowering knowing that we were not just passive recipients of decisions made elsewhere but active participants in defining what community governance should look like moving forward. As I looked around at those who rallied together, sharing experiences and advocating for change, I recognized how far we'd come from feeling isolated under oppressive scrutiny within our own neighborhood. This journey wasn't merely about reclaiming rights. It was evolving into a movement toward justice built from collective voices determined not only to stand against fear-based tactics, but also create a neighborhood characterized by cooperation and respect instead of discord. While we knew challenges lay ahead, especially if resistant attitudes persisted within HOAs, it was assuredly clear. We would face them together as allies fighting back against unjust control mechanisms designed to silence dissenters in favor of conformity. And above all things, Max and every resident deserved better than what had previously been tolerated under this regime, a reality now within reach merely because we dared step forth with courage against injustice. With the momentum of our actions gaining traction, the sense of community solidarity grew stronger. As neighbors began to share their stories of mistreatment by the HOA, it became clear that we were part of a much larger struggle for justice and fairness within our neighborhood. The collective voice of residents who had once felt isolated under the HOA's oppressive tactics was now uniting, and this newfound camaraderie was both inspiring and empowering. At one of the community gatherings, I noticed a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Residents who had previously been hesitant to speak up now shared their experiences openly. Karen, who had faced fines for having a bird feeder deemed an eyesore, passionately recounted how she had felt cornered and vulnerable. Listening to her story resonated deeply with everyone present, reminding us all that our grievances were not isolated incidents, but rather symptoms of a systemic problem. Her voice sparked a wave of similar accounts, as others began to recount their encounters with arbitrary fines and selective enforcement. This outpouring of grievances created an electric energy in the room. People laughed, cried, and expressed frustration over their experiences, but above all, they felt empowered to take action. It was exhilarating to witness this transformation. Neighbors who once exchanged polite nods now stood shoulder to shoulder, advocating for their rights. The sense of shared purpose breathed life into our fight against the HOA's overreach. During these meetings, we discussed potential strategies for collective action. Some residents suggested organizing a petition demanding a review of HOA policies and practices, while others proposed forming a community advisory group to ensure every voice was heard moving forward. The emphasis on unity became our rallying cry. Together, we were stronger than any ruling body that sought to instill fear among us. As word spread about our collective determination to stand up against the HOA, even more residents began attending these meetings. I noticed new faces at each gathering, people who had long kept quiet but were now eager to join the movement for change. This influx of participants enriched our discussions and broadened our understanding of how deeply the HOA's tactics had affected various individuals in different ways. Among those newcomers was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman whose family had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She recounted how her husband had passed away during an altercation with HOA members over landscaping changes they disapproved of. Her story struck a chord with everyone. It underscored not only the personal impact of these regulations, but also the emotional toll inflicted on families grappling with loss and hardship while facing unyielding bureaucracy. Empowered by this sense of solidarity, we decided to organize a formal meeting with the HOA board. Our goal was simple: to present our concerns collectively and demand transparency in policy enforcement while seeking assurances that residents would be treated fairly moving forward. We wanted them to know that they could no longer operate without accountability. In preparation for this meeting, David played an important role in helping us articulate our demands clearly and effectively. He encouraged us to outline specific changes we wanted, such as clearer guidelines on what constituted violations, and establishing a process for residents to appeal decisions made by the HOA without fear of reprisal. Together, we crafted a respectful yet firm letter emphasizing our commitment to collaboration while firmly standing against unfair practices. As we approached the meeting date, anticipation built within the community. We rallied support by encouraging neighbors to attend and show unity. It was important that the board saw just how many residents were committed to enacting change. On that day, I felt an immense wave of pride as I looked around at my fellow neighbors standing together, not just as individuals facing their own battles, but as a united front determined to reclaim fairness within our beloved neighborhood. When we finally faced the board members that evening, their initial defensiveness seemed softened by our numbers and determination. The palpable tension morphed into something more constructive, an opportunity for dialogue fueled by shared concerns rather than hostility born out of fear. Our voices echoed in that room as we presented our case. A plea for accountability from an organization that had strayed from its mission of fostering community spirit toward one defined by control through intimidation. In that moment, I understood that we weren't merely fighting for ourselves. We were paving the way for future generations who deserved better than what had been tolerated under oppressive rule. The impact of our collective response was undeniable. It became evident that solidarity not only amplified individual voices, but also forged pathways toward fostering lasting change within our community's governance framework. As I reflected on this journey so far, I knew it marked just the beginning of what we could achieve together, if only we continued standing strong against injustice hand in hand. Reflecting on this journey, I've come to understand profound lessons about the complex dynamics of authority, community engagement, and individual rights. Navigating the treacherous waters of our HOA's overreach illuminated the sometimes fragile balance between governance and personal freedoms. Initially, like many residents, I felt subjugated by a system designed to maintain order, but instead operated through intimidation. However, my experience also underscored how collective action can awaken the spirit of advocacy among members of a community. The moment I decided to confront the HOA was pivotal, not just for me, but for everyone who had been silenced by fear. Armed with knowledge and support from David and our neighbors, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. It became evident that authority must be held accountable. Unchecked power can lead to abuses that erode trust and cooperation within a community. Through this process, I recognized that every individual has the right to advocate for themselves and should not shy away from standing up when faced with injustice. Our collective outcry against the HOA stirred something deeper within our neighborhood, a recognition of shared struggles. As residents shared their stories, we learned that our individual grievances reflected a systemic issue that required a unified response. This sense of solidarity transformed our dynamics. We became allies in the fight for fairness rather than isolated individuals facing the harsh realities of HOA enforcement. The experience taught us that fostering equity in governance requires vigilance and accountability. By preparing thoroughly to present our concerns to the board and demanding transparency in rule enforcement, we laid the groundwork for future generations to enjoy a neighborhood characterized by cooperation rather than fear. This shift in perspective emphasized the importance of open dialogue between governing bodies and residents, ensuring that community standards serve their intended purpose, to enhance the quality of life and promote unity among neighbors. As we faced the HOA board, it became clear that our formidable presence as a group sent ripples through their established authority. The change in their demeanor from defensiveness to a more conciliatory attitude signified that they recognized the legitimacy of our complaints. It was a victory not just for us, but for all those who had ever felt marginalized within their own community. By standing up together, we began to redefine what it meant to belong in our neighborhood. However, it is crucial to be vigilant even amidst these victories. While the HOA's initial response was promising, ingrained attitudes don't change overnight, old habits linger, and not every member may fully embrace accountability. The uphill battle toward genuine reform requires continual engagement from us as residents. It also involves holding each other accountable, something that extends beyond HOA interactions into other aspects of community life. Maintaining this delicate balance between governance and individual rights demands persistent advocacy. It is too easy to revert into complacency once issues appear resolved. Instead, we must remain actively involved in local governance discussions and advocate for initiatives that prioritize fairness and inclusion. Compounding our efforts will ensure that changes become far-reaching rather than temporary fixes. In remembering Max, who initially inspired my fight against injustice, I find renewed commitment to this cause, not just for him, but for the integrity of our shared space as a whole. He symbolizes the broader fight for rights that protect all creatures and individuals within our community, reinforcing our understanding that freedom means less when only available to some. Ultimately, this experience has become a transformative chapter in my life, one where I learned about strength and resilience within community structures. Standing up against authority isn't merely about resisting oppression. It's an essential aspect of cultivating thriving neighborhoods rooted in respect, cooperation, and shared responsibility. As we continue this journey together, I do so with hope, not just for my home, but for every resident who believes they could make a difference when they stand united against injustices threatening their quality of life.